Welcome to August's IBMSpod. I'm Ella, stepping in for Rob this week. This month, we're talking all things lab sustainability with Martin Farley, the Sustainability Labs Advisor at UCL and King's. We'll discuss why it's important to address sustainability and efficiency in the laboratory, and Martin will share some simple tips to help make your lab more environmentally friendly. Later on in Lab Life, we're joined by IBMS fellow Sheri to chat about sustainability in healthcare labs, virtual verifications, and becoming a verifier for the IBMS. Before we get to all that, here's the latest news.
The IBMS is calling for members to sign up to become verifiers or examiners for the IBMS registration and specialist portfolios. These vital roles help sustain the pipeline of future biomedical scientists. Listen out for more on this in Lab Life with Sheri Scott later on in the podcast.
This year, 5 IBMS members have been added to the prestigious Pathologist Power List. Congratulations to Anthony Manuel de Sousa, David Wells, Guy Orchard, Ian Davies, and Jane Mills on this remarkable achievement and recognition.
IBMS members are encouraged to apply for the Excellence in Healthcare Science Award, the latest in the Chief Scientific Officer's Healthcare Science Awards 2021. Nominations close on the 28th of August.
After one of its most impactful years yet, the British Journal of Biomedical Science will be moving to gold open access with new publishing partner Frontiers. From January 2022, all new articles in BJBS will be immediately and permanently available to access freely. You can find out more about our stories on our website and in the show notes.
So this month, we're joined by Martin Farley, who is a Sustainability Labs Advisor at UCL and King's. Martin was the first Green Labs professional in the UK, and in 2015 was awarded the Green Gown Award for his work at the intersection of lab management and sustainability. Welcome to the podcast, Martin.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you very much for having me.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. So with the UN Climate Conference, COP26, just around the corner, and with many linking the recent flash flooding in parts of London to the issue of climate change, it's front and centre right now. But not everyone might be aware of the impact laboratory spaces are having on the environment. So could you outline why this is so important that we are thinking of sustainability and efficiency in these settings, and then help us to understand the scale this is having on the science and the environment?
Sure. So first of all, I'll say outright is that we don't know the full carbon emissions of science. I think that's worth saying up front. And it's for the keen researchers out there, I think it's something that needs to be investigated in more depth. And there is some initial work that's going on, but it's a very complicated topic, as you can imagine. Yes, for a lot of reasons. But that being said, science, we know inherently is quite resource intensive and results in a lot of carbon emissions. Some of the stats that we use to highlight that are, for example, the classic one is around ultra low temperature freezers, which we use a lot in science, or minus 80s, consume around a house's worth of energy per freezer, and not taking into account the extra energy required to cool them in freezer rooms. Another example is, I think flight travel and data centers each consume around 2% of the world's carbon emissions, or responsible for, not consume, sorry. Science obviously is a portion of those. It's not the entire 2%, obviously, because it's obviously a lot of things are involved in that. But science requires a huge amount of data and a lot of flight travel. Labs themselves, when we look at research institutions on a smaller scale than globally, for example, at University College London, where I work, they consume around 52% of the energy, and roughly a comparable amount of our carbon emissions at UCL are coming from science facilities. And when we consider the breadth of what is taking place at UCL, I think that helps to highlight that science facilities and other specialist areas aren't always considered at the top of the list when it comes to environmental sustainability. But these specialist high impact areas are going to need to be part of the conversation if we're going to get to net zero and achieve the targets that we're talking about for COP26.
And when you're talking about a sustainable green lab space, what aspects of the lab environment do you tend to focus on when attempting to drive down emissions?
Well, historically, and traditionally, we often think about energy consumption, and I think energy consumption is gets focused on in part because it's easily quantified to start. We're paying for it at the end of every month, and it requires a lot of resources just to get that energy to us. So it's obviously people talk a lot about energy consumption, but energy consumption overall in terms of our carbon emissions is what you were asking about is actually relatively small. And when we think about all of the materials that we use and the embodied carbon that they represent. And part of that is because, particularly in the UK, a lot of work has been done to reduce the associated emissions with the energy that we consume, which is a good thing. And obviously, then that skews the emissions to come. They'll be heavier from the other sources, which is all the stuff we buy and we use in the buildings and et cetera, materials. So, if we're talking about green science and sustainable science, then energy consumption is up there, but material consumption, I think, is a much greater issue, and that relates to the equipment, the consumables, the plastics. Everybody thinks about the plastics, but of course, the things that I mentioned before, which is the data centers, and which also is materials and energy combined, and air travel, which varies depending in terms of a percentage based on your research subject.
And what would be some top tips for scientists wanting to make the lab more sustainable?
The top tips that jump to mind, of course, are closing a fume cupboard sash that reduces the flow rate when you don't need it, obviously, and generally, I will say is that any type of reuse or using materials more on site is a win. And so sometimes people associate sustainability with needing to go and just buy a bunch of new and more efficient stuff, versus I'd kind of argue the opposite. It's more about trying to repair and make more use on site of what you have. Air travel is a large contributor. So if people can attend their conferences online, I think the pandemic has sort of shaped that for us. So I don't know if I need to comment on it as much as maybe people would have a few years ago. But to be honest, that's why I started work on Leaf, was because we wanted to capture all the good things people could do in a simple to use, easily accessible format, and to standardize it to make it easy, because it's not clear always what scientists can do. I'd also say that people listening, you can always challenge yourself. You know your lab much better than I do, obviously. And so where the opportunities are for reuse and et cetera, and reduction, we can give you ideas, but the more specified solutions will come from within.
And moving on to your role itself, it's quite a fairly new role. It straddles the line between science and aspects of design, engineering, engagement, and more. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the role itself and your career path and journey into it. Did you follow a specific career path to get into this role?
I studied biology and did a master's in biology in the Netherlands, and worked a lot in a lab. Worked as a technician in the US as well. But I was seeking to combine topics, and because I wasn't the best researcher, and ended up wanting to combine it. At first, I was looking at music, but then I ended up combining it with sustainability, and started a post at the University of Edinburgh around sustainable labs. And then I thought it would last a few months, but it just kept going, really.
That's great.
Yeah. What were your passions behind doing this particular role? Why were you so motivated to be in this space?
I mentioned before my research didn't go that well. I couldn't help but notice the volumes of plastic in tissue culturing that had gone into the research that essentially didn't go super well. And I was seeing the amounts of plastic that I was creating every day and thought, wow, I wonder if there's anything we can do about that. And I got in touch with a fellow in the US, Alan Doyle, who put me in touch with a fellow in the UK. And that's how we set up the internship. So it was the thought of all that I'd used and not really gone someplace. And it turns out a lot of people thought the same.
Okay. Cool. So I'm going to hand over to Ella now to talk a bit more about the LEAF framework developed.
Really curious to hear about LEAF from you. So, we know that UCL, along with yourself, developed LEAF, which is the Laboratory Efficiency Assessment Framework. This is pretty recent, isn't it?
Yeah, we did pilot it for 2 years before putting it online, but we just launched it, softly launched it, I guess, in February of this year. And we're still working on it, I should say, but it's a fun project. So.
Cool. I guess we're interested to hear about how the framework works, what it intends to pinpoint within labs themselves. If you could just speak to us a bit about that.
Sure. So the way it works right now is an institution enrolls, and then we ask labs within those institutions to sign up. I think the best comparison I've found is with health and safety. Is that if you look at a health and safety directorate, that knowledge of how to be safe within your institution is, there's a local health and safety directorate that uses a national standard, HSE, that provides guidance on how to be safe within a lab space. And I think that's the best comparable of what we're trying to do with sustainability. We're trying to build local knowledge so that people can assess how sustainable they are based on a standard which everybody can use and compare. And so labs sign up and they work through the different levels. There's bronze, silver, gold levels for LEAF, and they work through the criteria and try to address the criteria, even if they're not able to achieve a criteria. Sometimes understanding why they can't achieve a criteria, I think, is more valuable than understanding why they did. And so they work through them, and then they can also estimate some of their impacts using the calculators within LEAF. And yeah, that's a very quick wrap up of the process.
No, that's great. I think, for a lot of our members working in healthcare, their labs will be run by individual trusts within the NHS. And so it's a different kind of scheme, if you will, than working within university research labs. So I guess, do you have any advice or ideas for implementing sustainability within healthcare labs specifically?
Well, I will say is that we've started to work on other, but let's start over. I should say that I've done some work outside of LEAF with the Royal College of Emergency Medicine have a sustainability group, and there's been some individuals there who have been working with, and we've built something called Green ED, which is a framework for emergency departments in the UK, which we're just starting to pilot now in 3 different sites. And I think that the process that we have within LEAF can be applied to other specialist areas with some slight rejigging to suit that setting. I think at the end of the day, getting back to the original point, is that all these specialist areas, if we're going to achieve these carbon targets, we need all the specialist areas to have standard approaches of how to be sustainable as well. And so that's what we're trying to help and deliver on.
Absolutely. So in terms of the implementation itself, if I'm running a lab and I'm interested in taking on LEAF, what steps do I go through?
Well, if your institution signed up, you basically sign up your lab online, and then you read the criteria and work through them. And some of the things are going to be on some of the top tips we were mentioning before around ventilation. One of my favorite is around tracking the materials of departing scientists and staff.
Can you explain that?
So there's, I think in most academic institutions, we have turnover and like anywhere. And when people go, it's always a busy time. And there's a tendency sometimes to leave, for example, a freezer full of samples or a drawer full of chemicals or reagents, and et cetera. And that knowledge of what to do with them sometimes departs with that person. Tracking what those people leave behind, making sure that it's shared, making sure that it doesn't sit there for 20 years and then get disposed of unnecessarily. Left for 20 years unnecessarily. I think it is a first step in terms of organizing all the stuff we have. I don't know if anybody's been within a sort of a messy chemistry lab or opened up a fridge full of toxins that we shouldn't be smelling. Sometimes they have to store those things, but ideally not for too long. And there's a bit of management around it so that we're not storing things unnecessarily, buying them 3 times and then throwing them away twice or something.
Yeah, I'm guessing that goes back to what you were saying before of the low temperature freezers, as well as, if you've got a freezer full of old samples taking up space, it's more energy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. It's and often just I should say a lot of this is good lab practice. Knowing what you have, where it is, how to access it, and where to dispose of it and how to dispose of it in a timely fashion is a lot of this is good lab practice. So it's not too. Sometimes people think we're going to ask them when you think about sustainability, just turn off all your freezers or something, and it's not that. It's about a lot of it aligns with what you're trying to do in the lab, anyways.
Right. I guess, what are the biggest roadblocks for labs and other institutions that have been implementing LEAF?
The roadblocks for them implementing LEAF,
or for having the highest standard of sustainability within the labs?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a good question. I think there's all. I will say that institutions seem to have quite different structures. Within some institutions, there's a very strong technical community that can implement criteria around LEAF, and then some don't have that. Some institutions have sustainability departments. Some of them don't. The smaller institutions don't have that support, and I think time. I think can always be a challenge. People without thinking about sustainability in this current era are already super busy in everything we do. We're all spending a lot of in team time in meetings and etc. So that's a barrier. I think if you can just overcome sort of critically thinking about your lab space, often the example given is people want to recycle at home. They do good stuff around environmental sustainability, and then at the lab, sometimes we don't think about it as much. And just switching that thinking maybe to apply it in the lab space is a challenge. But
right, especially when it's all so specified, within these different types of organizations or different, healthcare versus a university setting. It's all going to look different, but at the end of the day, the goal would be the same.
Yeah, I think I should mention as well, because you're talking about healthcare, and a concern as well is obviously is the appropriate sterilization of materials. You don't want to lead to more contaminations in the research people are doing. So I think one of the challenges is learning about that balance between health and safety and sustainability. Today's health and safety issues might cause sustainability issues in the future, but where's that balance? If everybody, I think COVID is a classic example. People talk about all the single-use plastics in terms of that we have for masks and gloves and etc. But could we sustain that over years and years? If anyways, God forbid, COVID stays at the current rate, but that's not today's topic.
Another issue.
Yeah.
And I guess, we're just curious, have you encountered any resistance to implementing these measures, or it's all people coming forward and really wanting to take this on as a challenge for their labs?
I'll just say is that within every institution, I think there's definitely more motivated individuals, and they definitely open doors. And I would always say is to start with those motivated individuals before trying to broach those who are less motivated and maybe don't have the time or capacity to look at it, and to show them that it's feasible locally before trying to get everybody at once, maybe.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Is there any possibility that these measures could actually affect the quality of science or be restrictive at all on the scientific process? Or could it be a good thing for reproducibility in science?
Oh, it's fantastic that you're bringing this up. One unique feature about LEAF is that we've considered research quality in a sense because around the issues of reproducibility, I think we recognize that science is very resource intensive. So if our science is not reproducible, in some ways, in my mind, that's the most unsustainable science of all. And if you're asking people to, it's a bit of a balance. We have criteria in LEAF that are focused on overall improving research quality. So, for example, very basic things like, have you calibrated your pipettes, or are you aware of the core facilities within your institution so that your experiment can be more reproducible between repetitions. But obviously, we don't want people to take enough risk that it jeopardizes a full experiment, which would then lead to you having to reproduce and use all those resources again. Or we don't want people to take such a risk with their freezer that they lose the freezer and they lose the contents of it and all of the work that's gone into it. So a lot of thought has gone into the criteria around LEAF, around striking a balance between improving research quality and improving environmental sustainability without a risk to the actual science itself. And I'm kind of excited because there's more directions this could go as well. But that's why with LEAF, we've been engaging with UKRN, which is the UK Reproducibility Network, and they've helped us look at those research quality criteria, and a few other organizations that we're looking to work with soon.
Oh, excellent. Cool. So I think Ella's going to do the quick fire round now. So hand over to her.
Do the quick fire. Basically, I'm going to have a sentence for you, and then you can finish it for us.
Oh, wow, okay.
So the most important change I should make to be more eco-friendly in the lab right now is?
Sign up to LEAF. I don't know. There's too many different things. Or just say, think about sustainability.
Just think about it and sign up for LEAF. That's great. No, it works. I think, you've pulled all the resources and information, so it makes sense. The most harmful part of the lab or laboratory procedure that has the biggest negative impact on the environment is?
Single-use consumption, probably, I would say.
All those pesky pipette tips. Yeah.
If it's lab use, it's definitely the single use. If you're out of a lab, if you're like a behavioral psychologist, then it becomes your air travel.
Cool. The piece of lab equipment which uses the most energy is?
Fume cupboards, typically. I think freezers probably aren't too far behind.
Okay. And is that has to do with the ventilation mainly?
Yes, and the volume of them that are out there. For chemists, it's definitely the fume cupboards. For life scientists, it's probably more the freezers.
Okay. And as a laboratory scientist, I should care about sustainability because?
We live on one planet. I don't know how else to say. Yeah, I think. Yeah, you don't need me to say it, hopefully, but yes, check out David Attenborough and to spend some time on.
Have you heard of David Attenborough? No,
yeah, I was just that's a better answer. Yeah.
No, that's great. So, I think it's all exciting and interesting to hear about, and I really encourage our membership to go and check out LEAF, even if it's not something you can directly apply within your lab. I'm sure there's tips that you can take away and do on the ground. So thank you so much, Martin.
Thanks, Martin, for joining us.
Thank you, Jordan, as well. You've both been lovely, and yes, much appreciated for taking the time.
In this month's Lab Life, we're joined by Sheri Scott. She's a trained biochemist with over 21 years' experience, and she is now a senior lecturer in biomedical science at Nottingham Trent University. Sheri is also an active fellow at the IBMS, carrying out a plethora of roles relating to her professional practice. These include as a verifier and assessor for the IBMS registration and specialist portfolios. Sheri has also recently become an advocate for sustainability in the lab and has written August's feature piece for the Biomedical Scientist magazine on the topic. Welcome, Sheri, to the podcast. Hi.
Thank you.
So we've just had a Sustainable Labs advisor, Martin Farley, previously on the podcast. And he was talking about the LEAF framework, the protocols that scientists can implement for being more sustainable in the lab. Now, I know you've just written a piece on this for the Biomedical Scientist magazine this month. What environmental issues do biomedical scientists face themselves within healthcare laboratories, and what actions can be taken to try and increase sustainability?
There are certain things biomedical scientists can't necessarily do themselves. They don't have any control over the amount of samples that come into the laboratory, and samples and testing has the biggest impact on the carbon footprint. What they can do is help educate the clinicians to reduce unnecessary testing. They can look at what they're using within the lab and maybe turn off computers at the end of the day. They can look at what can be reused and recycled. So they can take a look at potentially the reagent bottles that come in that generally go to waste. They can look at how they streamline their waste disposal, so whether it needs to go for incineration, potentially if it can be recycled, what we can do to get the recycling underway. They can look at the types of batteries they use in the equipment, and such as the batteries in UPSs. Can we use a more environmentally friendly battery? They can look at what they're bringing in for their own lunches. Did they have a hot lunch or a cold lunch? They're just some of the little things that we can do. So we might not be able to have a big impact, but every little counts.
Do you think that the profession might implement something like LEAF that Martin was talking about earlier, or a protocol?
I think there is it needs to be led from the top down. There is a big drive by NHS England to embed the sustainable goals within the culture of the NHS. I think we can look at introducing more education with staff, such as induction processes, so we can also, with bringing in new students that have had the education surrounding the SDGs and sustainability, it's the way that they can embed that into the culture of the lab. They can look at their own employment policies and training. So is there a way that they can work towards the sustainability goals surrounding employment, ensure that equality and diversity, so that they can reduce any inequality within the lab? There are some of these areas that we do really, really well within the NHS, but there are certainly areas for improvement. And by incorporating objectives such as LEAF, you get the whole of the department working to a common goal. And also they can use it to enhance their own reputations.
Absolutely, yeah. And you mentioned these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and you've explained a little bit more actually in your article. Could you just explain what is meant by them and what the NHS is doing right now with them?
So the SDGs are development goals that the United Nations have introduced to try and reduce the inequality, to end poverty and improve and protect the planet. And the NHS have taken these goals and put together a sustainable management plan. Reduce hunger, make sure we've got a quality education, that there is a fair and equal opportunity for education, and they're implementing environment programs, looking at their consumption and production, and trying to have a better impact on the environment and on poverty. So what they've got is this sustainable management plan that embeds these SDGs into themes, so that they can look at employability, they can look at the climate and try and work towards smarter working, mental health, quality, diversity and inclusion, and looking at to support carers. I think it's all about getting individuals to think about their own practice. It's about working together. And also, yes, environment is important, but we've also got to think about our own health, what we can do to make ourselves healthier and improve our own mental well-being.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting that this issue of sustainability is arising right now in the lab, isn't it? Because people tend to think of it in their home, in their personal lives, like what can I do myself to reduce my carbon footprint? Should I not fly as much? Should I turn the washing machine down? But in the lab space, this is something Martin was saying, it's not something that scientists, biomedical scientists, or anyone working in a lab tends to think about as much, is it?
You've also got the issue where when we're striving for quality, your hands are tied about what you can reuse. You're also conscious of the fact that you've got reagents and quality controls that have limited expiration, whereas potentially if you're in a teaching environment, you're not so concerned about the exact results that you're getting, whereas you have to be concerned within a clinical laboratory. So there are some things you can do in the lab, but there are some things that you can't because of UCAS, because of the ISO standards and that strive for getting the right result. You've got to make sure you're sticking to elements that the manufacturers set.
Yeah. Do you think there will be any resistance of doing this in any form?
I think we're all working to a common goal. We all recognise the importance of sustainability. It might be a buzzword at the moment, but it's a buzzword that's gaining traction. Everyone recognises you just have to look out the window to see what's happening with the weather. It's in the news. As I say, I think everyone wants to work to the same goal. So I think providing there aren't any impacts on quality or impacts financially, we're all going to be looking to try and do what we can.
Okay, that sounds excellent. So one of the measures the IBMS is implementing to improve sustainability is to move towards conducting verifications and assessments for our registration and specialist portfolios virtually, so there's less travelling involved. And right now we've been running a campaign to encourage members to sign up and become verifiers and examiners. Now, you've been doing this role for a few years now, so could you tell us a little bit more about the role and why should a member listening think about signing up?
It's a great experience. You get lots of communication experience, networking opportunities, you share best practices. So you are not only developing yourself, you're also taking some key tips and tricks back to the lab. You get to pick up some great ideas for the variety of evidence that your potential trainees can use. You get to see new equipment and new techniques in play. I've learned far more about the other disciplines through doing assessment than I did when I was actually working in a clinical biochemistry laboratory, because you don't get to see what the other disciplines do. You get to potentially share resources. So if you see something that a lab is particularly doing, you can approach the training officer to see if they'll be willing to share ideas and resources. You get a network building, so you get to make contacts with other labs. There's something that you potentially can collaborate on. So you get potentially research opportunities. You get to top up your own knowledge, so it's a great CPD opportunity because you're learning about the new and current, as well as reinforcing things that you might have forgotten about. So and also you get to see how some of the problems that you're facing in your own lab are similar in other labs. So you don't feel so isolated. So it's great for your own health and well-being if you're feeling that little bit stressed about certain situations that you've got no control over. So there's great deal of benefits out there for being an assessor.
Yeah. Why is it so important then that we actually have these roles existing within the profession?
I'm a firm believer that quality training equals quality practice. And so we need to be able to do the best for our trainees so that they can go on and practice to produce that correct test result on the correct patient in the timely manner. And then they can then go on and train the next generation of biomedical scientists. So by going out and assessing, you're not only getting that new workforce in their role quicker so that we can get bodies on the bench, but you're also ensuring that we've got a quality workforce to replace an ageing workforce. You're doing your bit to ensure that there are enough bodies within the lab that are producing those right results to benefit the patient pathway and get those results to the clinicians.
Excellent. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for agreeing to do this. It's been really interesting. Sheri's article focusing on the environmental issues facing biomedical scientists and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals is available now. And if you're thinking about signing up to become a verifier or examiner, there is more information in the link in our show notes.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. These podcasts are released monthly at the same time the magazine comes out, so whenever a new issue lands on your doormat, head back online to listen to a new episode. And don't forget that these podcasts can be used for your CPD. Take care and bye.